Well, after last week when we got these dire hogs all finished up, I mean, they're looking pretty great, but wouldn't it be nice if I had something to accompany them, to, play with them on the D&D table? Now that I think about it, I've got that building left over from probably last year. And I got these really cool fences from a really long time ago. In fact, I can't even remember when I made these, but they're a 3D print that's available for free online. I'll have to see if I can find that and link it in the description for you guys. But it feels like something's missing. What if there was some kind of farmland? Yeah, that could be a fun, easy project. And I think I know just the thing I'm going to use to make that. Welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we're going to be working on a little farmhouse. Now, the farmhouse itself was built in a previous video, and I will link that in one of the corners up there. Now, that's not really a tutorial. I was just kind of having to play around and learning how to do that. So if you're looking for a tutorial on that, there are tutorials that will be coming down the road once I get a little bit more experience under my belt with making these sort of things. Trust me, it's on its way along with a few other things that you guys have been requesting. I just gotta get that skill under my belt. In addition to that, today we are going to be working on not just painting that house, but we're going to be doing some farm fields. Now, farm fields are actually really easy, and I learned how to do these from the Flames of War guys that used to come into my game store. I say used to because this game store no longer has a physical location. However, I learned a lot of stuff from those guys as they've been in the hobby for a very long time. So let's go ahead and get into this using a dollar store welcome mat. Yeah, that's right. We're going to the dollar store. So starting out, we're going to be using a floor mat from the dollar store. Now, something with these little grooves in it is going to work best. I prefer to get something that doesn't have anything more than these 3 grooved lines. Any more than that and it stops looking like a tilled field. Honestly, if you can find something that just has a singular bump, low spot, singular bump, low spot, that tends to be the best for this sort of thing. But this is an extreme case. I wanted to get like a worst case scenario and show you that it still does work. Now, if you're going to pick something out that's got like a pattern built into it, then it's really not going to look like a farm field. So you want to try and keep this as simple as possible. Now you can see here I'm cutting off about 2 inches off of the side. I'm just trying to get these rounded corners off so that I have a square surface to work from. I'm not really going to be keeping these. This is just scrap that I'm going to throw away. However, if you kind of have more of a cottagecore universe for your D&D or whatever tabletop game you're making these for, you might want to keep these for having little farms or little flower beds to go out in front of different houses for your tabletop. In my case, I don't tend to really do that sort of thing or even mention that people have little flower beds in front of their houses, so that's a little extra detail that I'm not going to worry about. Now that we have a square corner to work from, I need to decide just how big I want these farm fields to be. Now in my case, I figured that I was going to end up using these fence lines often to kind of mark out the various farm fields. So I need to figure out about how long that is. Turns out that 2 of these comes out to just barely shy of 8 inches. So it looks like 8-inch squares are going to be my mark. Now I do make 1 full-size 8-inch square, and then I also make 2 8x4, which can be put into an 8-inch square. This is going to give me some real variety for when I want to go ahead and lay things out, whether I'm using these for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, or I'm using them for D&D, or Frostgrave, or anything like that. So, depending upon the game that you're playing and the scale that that game is, you may decide that you want something bigger or smaller. If you're using something like Flames of War, you're probably not going to want anything much bigger than a 4-inch by 4-inch square. Now once you get your pieces all cut out, you might have some frayed edges. A really good way to get rid of these is with either a little blowtorch or like a Zippo or a lighter of some kind, and just kind of run it along the edge really quick. If you don't have something like that, you can also use a paint stripper, but honestly, if you're going to do this, do it outside. It is going to give off fumes because you are melting plastics, so keep that in mind and keep your health as a priority. Once you get the squares cut out, you can just spray paint them with some brown spray paint. I don't recommend painting them by hand because it's just going to soak up a ton of paint. I used my airbrush and it still soaked up a ton of paint. honestly, just go get a cheap can of brown spray paint at Walmart or something, and it's going to do you a lot better, because you're probably still going to have to do 4 or 5 coats even with spray paint. But it is worth it. Just hit it with some brown, and then you can dry brush it with any additional colors you want. I just left mine as brown because they're not really the star of the show. They're just meant to kind of give the illusion that these are fields, and they don't need to be anything super fancy. So brown is good enough. Now, I'm a sucker for that old English cottage style housing that we tend to see in more typical fantasy or high fantasy type buildings in D&D. So I'm going to be using Titan Buff from Golden. I'm going to be spraying this through my airbrush. Now, for as much as I'm not a big fan of contrast paints, I do really love using them for doing woods and quick things like that. So this is a really great jumping off point for the wood color, as well as it's pretty much that exact same Wraithbone color that GW wants you to use for the contrast paints anyway. And this is a really great cheap alternative. So if you've got a place where you can buy Golden brand acrylics, you might want to go grab yourself some Titan Buff and save yourself some money. But we're just going to do a real quick all over. Now, there are 3 browns that I typically use for contrast paints for my wood effects, and it depends on the effect that I'm kind of going for, and I may mix some washes in to get some other effects, but those 3 colors I typically use are Slayer Flesh, Skeletal Horde, or Gorguntha Fur. Now, in this case, we're using Gorguntha Fur, and I'll be using some Skeleton Horde on the door, followed with some Agrax Earthshade to kind of darken things up a bit. But that's pretty much going to be it. I'm not really going to be doing anything crazy with the wood. You could hit this with a dry brush and really make it pop, but this is just meant to be a simple farmhouse. This isn't meant to be anything fancy. It's not like it's going to belong to the big bad guy or a hero home or something where the players are going to be interacting with it all the time. It doesn't need to be anything super fancy. So 1 single coat should do it, and that is going to be 1 thick coat. Now, one interesting to note that you might notice in some clips that are about to happen, I do miss a few spots. I am constantly going back in and fixing the wood because I just constantly miss spots. This is just one of those things. You got to accept the fact that you're going to miss an angle, you're going to miss a single plank. There's a lot of stuff here to paint as a wood color. Don't feel bad if you're doing something similar at home and you constantly find stuff that you missed that you thought you should have gotten already. On a big project like this, even I miss stuff all the time, and like 5 or 6 steps later, I'm still fixing the wood, so don't feel bad about it. So for some reason, I have like 6 bottles of Ultramarine Contrast Blue, so we're just going to use some of that and start using that up, because the roof is going to take a whole lot. Hence why I'm using a comically large brush compared to the size of the bottle. We're going to be using quite a lot of this paint, and it's important to get it and move it around. Now, could I put this on a palette? Absolutely. But I'm lazy, so we're just going to do our best to make sure we don't accidentally get anything on the wood. If we do, we can just use a clean brush with some water to go ahead and wick it back off of the wood and clean things up. Now, I want to be really attentive about getting all up in all of these shingles. This is made from cardstock, so it's really important to keep in mind that we don't want to flood this part of the model, as the cardstock, if it gets anywhere where the primer didn't, it's just going to soak up the paint and it could puff up or it could release from the model. So despite how much paint we're actually putting on here, we need to keep it moving, and we need to make sure that it doesn't pool too much, because that can cause some issues. And if things do puff up or the glue starts to break free, we are just gonna have to rip those shingles off and replace them somehow. And this late in the project, that could be a real big problem with trying to get things to match back up color-wise. Moving on to these large flagstones around the base of the miniature. Now, this is what I typically use for my flagstones on fantasy builds: Dawnstone, Davenger Blight Dinge, and Fenrisian Grey, as well as something like a Xandri Dust, or maybe something slightly brighter, depending upon what I want. Then I kind of hit that up with a dry brush of Dawnstone. Now again, in this case, this isn't meant to be anything crazy, so we're not going to be putting that Dawnstone dry brush over the top of it. We're just going to hit it with a little bit of wash and then leave it. But I just want to kind of break up these flagstones real quick. I'm just going to base everything in Dawnstone, and then I'm just going to pick out different stones and paint them in with some of these other colors, and then let that dry, and we can come back in with some washes afterward. Now, me being lazy, not wanting to sit around and wait for paint to dry, I'm going to go ahead and hit these shingles up with a dry brush. Now, I initially started with using a slightly brighter blue than my base coat, realized that this dried so much darker than I thought it did, and decided to go with a much brighter blue. I ended up actually just using Fenrisian gray blue. It's a really nice bright sky blue, and when you go super light on the shingles, it works really well. But having these two different tones of blue on top of each other actually created a really nice variation in the shingles. So ultimately, if you're going to do something like this and you're following along at home and you want the same style roof, I actually do recommend using two different kinds of blue for this dry brush. One that's very close to your original base color, and then one that's significantly brighter. I think you'll get a much nicer and more random result that will look like a weathered roof. Now it comes time to apply the washes. Now, this is entirely up to you if you're doing something similar at home. I'm using Agrax Earthshade. I'm also using Athonian Camo Shade. You may want to use some Seraphim Sepia, but the amount of shade you use and the level of which you allow it to pool and how many recesses and corners and nooks and crannies that you push this stuff into is going to directly relate to how dirty the house looks and how old / dilapidated / abandoned it may come across. I want this to look like a farmhouse, and although it is not super dirty for a farmhouse, it is dirty enough. You know, if this was owned by someone who was well-to-do, it'd be a fairly clean house, and in fact the walls would probably be a much brighter white. Then one of the last things I want to do to go ahead and finish this off is to go ahead and paint all the windows black. This is just because I have zero desire to put lights on the inside of this, and it doesn't have a playable interior, so I'm just going to go ahead and paint them all black. Now, you've probably noticed a lot of the scraggly looking bits on the roof. That is just hot glue that got away from me when I was building this, and I was too lazy to try and clean it up at the time. And once it's solidified all the way, it's kind of there. And I actually came up with what I thought was a pretty great solution to fix this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cover these little bits up with some PVA white glue. That's the same stuff that kids use at school all the time. And then we're going to be covering up with a little bit of foam flock. And this is going to kind of look like leaves and debris and maybe some moss kind of growing on the roof. I think this works really great for a farmhouse. I don't know if I would really do this all over if I was doing like a full city build, but I think for this it works really nice and it looks really wonderful. In the future, I'm definitely going to have to find a way to be a lot neater with my hot glue so that stuff like this doesn't happen, because this definitely isn't a permanent solution ongoing forward. If I'm going to be doing more of these builds, I don't need tons of moss all over every building in town, but maybe a fair few of them. And there we have it with our final result. I am super pleased with this, and actually now that I have finished this farmhouse, I'm kind of blown away by the fact that I didn't do this sooner. I actually had a lot of fun painting this little house, and although it was out of sight, out of mind, I was very aware of it. I see it all the time. In fact, I see it almost every single day. And it's kind of interesting to me just how much I really fell in love with the project. It makes me really want to build some more. However, I don't really have a great setup for building tons of little foam houses like this. I don't own any kind of special foam cutter outside of a handheld hot wire cutter, and it can be really difficult to consistently cut shapes. So I actually, when I built this, I mostly did this using an X-Acto knife, which took a very long time to cut out all the little pieces, and it kind of killed my love for the project while also sparking my love to want to do more. It's this weird middle ground of like Schrodinger's cat of, do I actually really love this project or do I actually really hate this project? Well, cat's out of the bag at this point now. I really love this project and I definitely want to do some more. But I'm definitely going to have to come up with a better way to cut out all these little beam pieces, because they definitely really make this building. They really sell the illusion of this being a fantasy cottage. In any case, I hope you guys loved today's project as much as I loved working on it. And until next time, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty.